Welcome to AUA Leadership in Business, an official podcast of the American Urological Association. This episode is brought to you by the AUA Young Urologists Committee.
Thank you all for joining us. This is the Young Urologist Committee podcast, determining what practice to enter. I am Rachel Mann. I'm a current reconstructive urology fellow at Leahy Clinic and president of the Residents and Fellows Committee. And I have with me Dr. Seth Cohen from City of Hope.
It's a pleasure to be here, Dr. Mann. Thanks so much for having me. So as said, my name is Seth Cohen. I'm the current chair of the Young Urology Committee for the AUA. It's a pleasure to be here with you. My position, I am a urogynecologist, female urologist, FPMRS urologist, however, whatever moniker you'd like to use, at City of Hope, which is an institution in Southern California. And so I have a specialty focused practice. And this is a very important topic to talk about for up and coming young urologists because it impacts your day-to-day and your livelihood.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. I look forward to our chat tonight. So just to kind of kick things off, I thought maybe you could talk generally about some of the advantages and disadvantages to the different practice models. What are the different practice models that you can look for when choosing a job?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of different practice models out there. It's only limited to creativity to some extent, but in general, there's private practice, right? So private practice, it could be a small a group of several urologists. Private practice could be a very large group of urologists, could be what we call a LUGPA, or a large urology group practice. And essentially, these are urologists that don't work for a hospital system or an academic center. They essentially own their practices or indirectly own their practices. And they kind of make a lot of decisions about their day-to-day. They control a lot of their schedules and what their practice looks like. There's also employed urology, and employed urology could be anything from working for an academic health system to working for a Kaiser system to working for a hospital system. And for all intents and purposes, you are an employee of a hospital system where you, to some extent, are kind of told where to go and what to do and who the people you are working with. You don't have a whole bunch of control over that. There are probably variations on that, but you also don't have to be involved in a lot of the HR and hiring and the decisions on the business side day to day. And so those are probably the different divergent pathways: are private practice versus employed urology. And then within those two different contexts, there's subcontext within that as well.
So if you could talk to us a little bit about what your current practice looks like at City of Hope, what is your setup? What is your kind of day-to-day?
Certainly. So I'm an employed urologist. So I work for, I'm employed by the City of Hope Medical Foundation. I have benefits through City of Hope. I have a very busy subspecialty practice, and I work with a lot of other urologists, but I also work with surgical oncologists and medical oncologists. And so it's various doctors from a lot of different streams of medicine, all working together under the umbrella of one organization. And so my day-to-day is I get to go to work at a place I really enjoy working at. I get to see a focused population that I really take a lot of satisfaction in treating and caring for. And I don't have to worry too much about hiring the reception team or the medical assistants or the LVNs because the people that I work for take care of that to some extent. And so the model that I've chosen allows me to avoid some of the business side of things to some extent. I have a benefits package that I'm provided for by my institution, including a retirement setup. And to me, that's kind of what I was interested in. I wanted to go into an environment where I could really focus on the actual medicine and the surgical care of patients. I wanted to worry a little bit less about the business side of things. Not that you can never fully take your mind off that. That is always something you have to have in the back of your mind. You have to be knowledgeable of that, but not some of the nitty-gritty day-to-day impact of the business side of things. And I also liked working in a larger group that was going to allow me to get referrals from my colleagues and have easy access to specialists and knowledgeable people shoulder to shoulder to work on some complex patients. And that was kind of all afforded by this model that I chose to go into in this employed environment. And I have to say, it's worked well for me. I've got no complaints about that. Now, one could argue, well, Seth, when you want to take a vacation, you got to submit a form with your dates on it and get that approved. That's accurate. That's true. Well, Seth, when you want to close a clinic, you've got to have one or two different people authorize you to close that clinic if you want to perhaps, leave early to go to some engagement or event that I'm committed to. Well, that's true. And so you do have to be comfortable with those layers, because you don't actually own the clinic. You don't actually own the schedule. That's really something that you're partaking in, but you are employed. So those are decisions that ultimately have to be approved by other people. Now, some people don't like that, and some people don't want that, and that's perfectly fine. You have to realize the type of person you are and what potential environment you're going to thrive in.
That makes total sense. And I have to admit, I hadn't thought of that being a decision point. If you have total flexibility of your own schedule versus having to essentially report or ask somebody higher up to take time off or to close clinics, that's a great point you make. Obviously, you're a fellowship trained urologist. Do you think your decision to pursue a fellowship, a subspecialty in urology, impacted what type of practice you were looking for?
For me, it certainly did. It certainly did. Because I knew to see the population I was most passionate about seeing, I really needed to be in an environment where I was going to be getting referrals from my colleagues. And so it's hard to do that. If I was just by myself in a private practice, I think that'd be harder to do. I mean, it depends on the image you mold and how you portray yourself and communicate your image to the region you're living in and you're a part of. But to some extent, there's so much general urology out there. There's such a need for general urology that it's hard not to get, in my mind, subsumed or consumed by that in an environment where maybe you're in a small private practice or in a private practice by yourself, because there's always such a need for that. You would almost have to be turning patients away, and maybe some people do. But I really want to be in an environment where I had colleagues around me that were doing general urology in addition to endourology, in addition to reconstructive urology for men like you, Dr. Mann, I'm presuming, and urethroplasties, because those are not things I do, nor are they things that I'm focused on doing or really desiring to do to some extent, because I've got a subspecialty that I really have meaning in and want to contribute to. So for me, it made sense to be in an environment where I was able to get those referrals from my colleagues, as opposed to being in a smaller group where I might be getting exposed to more general urology all the time. Now, you could have a similar environment in a large urology group practice in a LUGPA. I mean, that's also possible as well. And so some of these things are still possible in large private practices, but I thought for myself, I'd want to be in an environment where I could get referrals from my colleagues, and that was probably going to be in a large practice, very likely multi-specialty setting.
And we've all heard stories of folks who have been fellowship trained in one thing and joined a practice and have been pigeonholed into doing something else. And so that again makes total sense to me. I want to switch gears a little bit. People listening to this talk are probably new grads or people close to finishing residency or fellowship who are looking to take their first job. Are there any red flags that grads should look out for when joining a practice, or, from your experience, from your first job hunt? Anything people should be mindful or wary of?
Oh, there's a lot of things. I mean, we could talk a long time about that. I mean, to some extent, I hate to say it, that's it's another reason to kind of look towards large established, institutions or even large practices, because to some extent, those contracts are very standard. I mean, when you go work for, a UCLA or for a Kaiser or for a, University of Chicago or wherever, Providence Hospital, to some extent, these contracts are very standardized. There's not a lot of wiggle room, and they kind of are what they are, but they're also fairly transparent. I mean, to some extent, there's a lot of information in there that it's pretty standard. And for a smaller private practice environment or even a small hospital, you really have to make sure you're going through that contract with a pretty fine-tooth comb, with probably some sort of contract expert, just to make sure that there's no surprises for you hidden within there. Some states have non-compete clauses where if you leave that practice, you can't practice within 50 square miles, right? That actually that doesn't exist in the state I'm in, but some states certainly do have that. And if that's something important you to be aware of, you got to read the fine details of your contract. If you talk to someone in the practice and said, oh, Dr. Smith just left and Dr. Riley left before her and Dr. Jones left before her, if there's a lot of turnover in that practice, red flag, right? I mean, generally, if people are happy, it's rare to see a lot of turnover. And so if you're kind of interviewing for a job that someone just vacated after a couple of years, your first question should be, why did Dr. So-and-so leave? What was going on? And then figure out what the practice composition has been like. Has there been a lot of throughput and turnover in the physicians that make up that practice? So that's another red flag. Another red flag is transparency of numbers and finances. If you ask about the finances, let's say you're interviewing with a group, I would think that the partners should feel pretty comfortable, seeing, you should be able to see what some of those salaries look like, perhaps all the salaries, maybe de-identified. Maybe you don't need to have names next to them, but you need to have a sense of what salaries look like, what take homes look like, what those numbers are, so that you're not operating in a black box when you're potentially joining into this group. You want to know what the numbers look like, and they should feel pretty comfortable telling you that. If they're not comfortable telling you that, that's another red flag.
Sure. Were there, on a topic of red flags, or factors to consider rather, were there some factors when you were first looking at a job that you thought were going to be really important? For example, call schedule or APP support or opportunities for research, thought were going to be really important to you initially, that later on you realized weren't quite as important, or the opposite? Were there factors that you didn't even think about that now you're in practice and say, oh my gosh, this really, really matters when you're joining a group, whether it's your partners or lifestyle, or the opportunity to train residents or fellows?
That's a great question. It's a really good question. When I first was looking for jobs, someone told me, and I'm sure many people listening have heard this, there's three things you need to think about when you're looking for a job: geography, finances, meaning what you're going to get paid, and the patient population you're going to treat. And in general, if you can get two of the three, you're doing quite well. Almost impossible to get all three, right? If you're getting two of the three, you're probably looking at a job that makes a lot of sense. And I urge all of the people listening to figure out, of those three, what are your one, your two, and your three, because the one's going to drive everything. And once you know what the one is, you've automatically filtered out 75 to 80% of the jobs out there. And then you're going to look at number two, and you're going to filter that down again. And then finally you get to number three. And three is generally a bit of a wash. I'll be honest, for me, my number one was geography. We had commitments of relatives that we really wanted to be in a certain geography. So that really kind of limited me down to a certain area. And then number two for me was patient population. I knew I had a subspecialty that I really was passionate about, that I wanted to be a part of. And so that was number two. Number three for me was actually the finances. We all want to get paid. We work very hard for what we do. We absolutely deserve that. But I wasn't going to quibble over a few thousand here and there, and vice versa. That was probably coming up third horse in the race. And so I think I'd encourage everybody to kind of think about what are your one, your two, and your three, and let that guide your search. Now, when you get into a job or you're thinking about jobs, what's the next most important thing that probably leads to longevity or lack of longevity in urology? I think that's call schedule, because that's where a lot of, in my opinion, the burnout happens in urology, is the call schedule. And so I absolutely would always ask, what's the call schedule like? How many hospitals are you covering? What is your expectations for the future? Because that's what's going to burn you out after 2 to 5 to 10 years, is the call schedule. So absolutely ask about the call schedule. That's never not been important. Even now for me, and even people older than me, and even as a trainee, that never becomes non-important. Okay.
Sure.
I think another thing that's important is support. We live in an era now with inboxes and messages, and there's just too much to handle on your own. So is there, what is your support? You have LVNs and MAs, or perhaps if you're fortunate enough to have an allied health professional as well to support your burgeoning practice, because you may start your first year being able to do it all, on your own, but you build up enough of a panel of patients by years 2 through 5 that, yeah, you're once again, you're going to have more longevity in your career if your employment or practice has an opportunity built in to have an LVN or MA dedicated to you, or have an APP dedicated to you, or perhaps shared with 2 to 3 other urologists. So I think it's another thing that's very, very important. What did I think was important that was not important? I don't know, all kind of seems important. I've adapted to a lot of different EHRs. I will say that. I think a lot of us have used Epic in our training environments, in our age categories. And it's always nice to have a really fancy EHR that can do templates and nice stuff. But, I've used a lot of EHRs in various hospital settings. And as long as you make it functional, make it your own to some extent, that probably is a part that can be moved in and out a little bit, is the EHR type.
Sure. That's a good one. That definitely has given me anxiety about switching EHRs in my future job potentially.
Yeah,
I want to ask
you
you.
get very comfortable with a certain EHR, and you got all you're very efficient, and boom, you change it, and you're like, oh God, I got to start over again. And but yeah, it's adaptable. You're adaptable.
I want to touch on the ability to train either residents or fellows or both. And I think this is something that a lot of people struggle with looking at their first job, because most people are fresh out of some sort of training program, may or may not feel confident yet teaching somebody else. What was that decision like for you? And, do you think there are pros and cons to taking a teaching role right away versus potentially later in your career?
Yeah, I think it's another good question. Once again, coming up in a residency, it's such a collaborative environment where there's a lot of education going on at all times. You really feel like you're on the fringe of developing knowledge, which is there's a lot of satisfaction in that. I think certainly people struggle this when they're looking for jobs, because once you jump into perhaps a model where there are no trainees around you, you worry about stagnation and not really keeping your mind sharp to some extent. I always enjoyed working with trainees. I've always enjoyed education. And so actually the job I took, though, had none of that when I first got to it. So when I joined my institution, there was really almost little to no training exposure for me. There was a little bit. We had some fellows around in another specialty of urology that would occasionally come to some of my cases, but I never really didn't have a trainee around to work with or educate. But I found other avenues. I actually worked through the American Urologic Association on the Medical Student Education Committee, which was another avenue for me to be involved in education that I took a lot of satisfaction in. So you don't necessarily have to have a job with a resident or fellow in it. There are other ways to participate in education, perhaps through the AUA or your section, in mentoring trainees that you don't necessarily have to have as a part of your job description per se. Now, as my job evolved, we ultimately we created a fellowship for my specialty at my institution. And that's been one of the great satisfying parts of my day-to-day, is now working with fellows in my particular specialty, which I think for me has been very satisfying. I think it would be, honestly, I'm kind of happy it took a little bit of time to develop, because I think it would have been really hard my first 2 years in practice to really be an effective mentor and educator for a trainee. Because I think that first 2 years of your practice, that is light speed learning. You do a lot of learning in residency and you do a lot of learning in fellowship, but that first 2 years of practice, you are running at light speed, because it is you. You walk into that OR, you are now the expert, and there's every expectation your outcomes are going to be good and have good patient satisfaction. And so you are constantly self-monitoring, self-educating, crystallizing your techniques. And it's hard to do that, I think, and educate at the same time. So I probably could have done it to some extent. I did do it a little bit, but I would say your first 2 years out of practice, hopefully you're not the core faculty member doing the education of a resident or fellow. Certainly a little bit of that's fine, but I would hope you're participating but not directing. Because that'd be challenging. I think you probably hit efficiency, in my opinion, at years 2 to 5. I think if you're years 2 to 5, you have a system worked out, you have your hospitals worked out, you have your block time worked out, you have the nurses that work with you, know the way you like to do things, then you're built to run. That's a great training environment, because then you got it all set up.
I have heard new grads who've gone into practice say something that really struck me, and it was, you should decide if you really enjoy teaching or if you enjoy mentoring, because there's a huge difference, as you pointed out. Teaching is hands-on, watching the PGY2 place a stent at 2 a.m. Versus, sitting down with somebody and having a cup of coffee and talking about career plans. Those are two very different ways to have impacts on trainees. So I think it's important to think about what you want and what you're good at and what you like doing. So those are really excellent thoughts you have. As we wrap up, is there anything else you think that we should know as we're joining our first practice? I know we've covered a ton of ground, and I really appreciate your time.
Oh yeah, God. I mean, this is such an important topic. And what I would want to say is, for those out there that are looking for jobs, consider reading the transition from residency to practice manual. So that's a publication put out by the AUA Young Urology Committee, and it's a fabulous publication. It's been around for a number of years now. I think we're on our 6th or 7th, maybe 7th edition. And that's pretty easy to find with Google. But if you just look for the transitioning from residency to practice manual with under the auspices of the AUA, it's a very nice 60 to 70 page document that goes through some of the details about contract negotiations and what to look for and when you're looking at a job. And you would gain a lot of knowledge just reading that. But I would say, you can be happy in a lot of environments. For instance, private practice, I just want to say, can be a very, very rewarding, amazing practice model, especially if you enjoy the business side of urology. And there's some really superstars out there that do this very well. And you can find them on social media and within the AUA. And it's just quite amazing the value they're delivering to their communities and regions by really making efficient models of and cost-effective models of urological care. And so, I mean, and there is something to be said for being a physician and business-minded person. You can create models of care and that actually would serve the community, and they otherwise wouldn't have access to you, perhaps. I mean, sometimes urologists that work in health systems are so specialized, they get focused to certain cities or areas of the health system, and they don't end up going to some of the nether regions and in rural areas. And so it's really some of the private practice doctors in the rural areas that are really making a huge difference for their regions and communities. But I would just go back to those three. I would say region, location, geography, whatever you like to call it, patient population that you want to treat, and then finances. And then figure out of that what is most important to you and let that drive your decision making, because that is a guiding light and it served me well.
That's great advice. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, make AUA Leadership in Business your go-to podcast. Subscribe today by searching AUA Leadership in Business on your favorite podcast app and enhance your leadership and business education needs.